Okay, so you're the tenor section leader from 09 or 11, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Then you make the transition, and I know you've told this story before, but you make the jump to snare drum. And if I'm not mistaken, you become section leader of the battery, of the whole battery. What went into that? Like, how did that all come about?
Was there a conversation for you to switch, or was it something that you just thought of on your own?
It was definitely a conversation. So Matt Cowan, he marched 09, 10, 11 on snare drum. He was a section leader in 2011, and him and I were really close. We're still really close, and we would just talk all the time about how we wanted things to be and what we wanted to do. And 2011 was great because we had great communication. And Parsons was, I don't know, maybe it was Joey, who was the bass section leader. Sorry if I got that wrong. But yeah, like Cowan and I always just talked about everything and where the group was at, and we would communicate with Scott. And so 2012 came, he wasn't able to do the season. He had to, deal with other things. And so there was, a lot of conversation with him still and with Scott. We would talk a lot about, who we thought was going to end up being that guy, because especially back then and still a little bit now, like that's always a conversation, right? With the vets, with the staff, and, sometimes the other section leaders. And so that was going on a lot. And I was just joking one day to Cowan, like, hey, what if I did it? And he was like, yeah. And he was at PASIC with Scott and told Scott, and Scott texted me. He was like, how's your left? And then we got on a call and talked about the possibility of it, just in terms of, the leadership for that year. And I still needed to audition. I still need to be able to do everything like at a really high level. And so I think this was sometime in October, and like end of October, and auditions are early December. And so, I just cracked down on getting my left jamming for auditions. And auditions were tough. They were different. I was still figuring out that rebound's way different than, all those years on quads.
Did it feel strange? Like at that highest level, jumping on snare, like Kevlar head, compared to the Mylar quad heads? Definitely.
And, like that season and that experience of playing on that head and that listening and that adjustment and using motion from quads, like all these things like really taught me a lot. But that was the first thing. It's like, oh, this feels weird. And it really helped me learn like the habits of snare drummers. Like, oh, like they don't have this other experience on this other head. And people say pad hands. Like it's rare you hear a quad drummer say pad hands or a bass drummer say pad hands. They're usually a snare drummer.
See,
I was not making that adjustment.
When you're talking about snare drummers, I thought you were saying like ego, they're
that too. No, I'm just kidding.
Sorry, George. Sorry.
It's all right. I own it. I wear it.
Yeah. So that was really strange. Marching was really weird at callbacks. Like I remember going up to Scott and Rudy, and they're just looking at me. I'm just like, I'm sorry. Like the weight is weird. Like it's not heavy enough. It's like when you're marching all season and Todd's like, all right, dump the tubs, like harnesses only. It's almost like, can we wear the drums? Because I'm so used to it.
Yeah,
my body's
you
all
carry
weird.
your weight totally different.
Oh yeah, you start to use the weight to help balance and to help make things smooth. And I just didn't know how to do that yet. And so, marching was a little bit awkward, trying to figure that out with the weight adjustment. And you might say like, you're just marching, but it's like, but at that point I was so dialed into how my body felt and like what the weight of the drum was, and it was way drastically different. And so those are the biggest things from the start. But it started as a conversation and still had audition, and it kind of went from there.
Was the experiment successful? I mean, you talked about it like, oh yeah, it'd be a good idea for me to do that. Not just being a snare drummer, a snare drummer and all the different, but battery section leader.
Yeah, it was
that position, from where you were.
It worked, Scott was the quad section leader, and that quad line was great.
That was a
2012. Amir just came in
and
kept
Chris,
Scott, Chris and Andrew. and they were jamming those quad. I was jealous seeing those quad brakes. Like, oh man, look at all those quad brakes they have. Like, it looks so fun. Yeah. But no, it was good. Like, that was a perfect fit. And then specifically Jared coming and teaching the quads, or excuse me, teaching the snares.
Right, because Jared was teaching RCC, but he wasn't teaching Blue Devils yet.
Right.
And 2012 was his first year.
Right. And so we made that decision. Maybe Scott knew. I just didn't know at the time. But, making that decision to audition for snare, at that time, I didn't know Jared was going to be on staff. And then one day.
Do you know why he was brought on? Like what the impetus for that was?
I think, I don't know in terms of why the other snare tech couldn't come back or whatever that, arrangement was. But I know that they wanted something different, and what Jared was doing at RCC as kind of the battery caption head, he was just producing a different way of drumming, and so I think that was something Scott wanted, just to add to the team along with like what Rudy was doing already. And so Jared called me one day and was like, "Hey, what do you think if I was a snare tech?" I was like, "What?" And so at that point, I was already a section leader at RCC with him being the quad tech or just instructor and working closely with each other. And we had a way of communicating. We had a nice shorthand going, and, he would be focusing on something, and I was able to, enforce that in a way that helped, create whatever we were trying to do. And it was just a good team of section leader, instructor. And so, when he told me that, I was like, all right, man, like, let's do this thing. And so it was fun. It was a lot of work, building trust with the other snare drummers, having 2 quad guys come in, but everyone was pretty receptive. Yeah. And it was good. We definitely, made deliberate decisions of how we wanted to change the setup, change how we moved, change how we thought about things. It was a good move.
Were you the only Blue Devil vet in the snare line in 2012, or were there more?
There were more. Yeah. So Keelan, Adam, and Chris, I believe, were the only vets. And Chris couldn't finish the season because he had a surgery on his hand.
Oh yeah. Chris from Hawaii.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
Chris Bright.
Chris. Yeah, Chris Bright.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you go to RCC after that, did you play snare, or did you go back to quads?
I went back to quads. Yeah. There was no.
Was that transition back like pretty?
It was cool.
Nonchalant.
It was definitely not nonchalant. Like, my left hand felt a little weird. I definitely had like a middle ground of going back to match and it not feeling good, and then trying to play some tradition, it not feeling good. So my left hand just was like in limbo for a while. And this drum felt heavy, but it was fine. It was fun. It was nice to be back on quads and drum with those guys one more season.
Anybody who knows me knows this. 2013 RCC, favorite indoor show.
Really?
Ever.
Wow.
I just felt like even though I remember I talked to after I saw it for the first time. I think it was at Rancho. We were in hospitality, and I was talking to Vega, and I was just like, man, like this show, because 2012 was obviously really good. Like, I think for the most part, people were like, when they saw the 2012 show, they were like, okay, who's taking second place? It was just kind of like the vibe, right? 2013 to me felt special in the message, in just how fresh and original, like all of that stuff that you guys ended up grinding on really hard, like all of that beginning stuff of drumming that way and drumming so visually, right? Since we have you, I wanted to ask, who came up with all that? Like all of the essentially sort of normal drumming stuff, all of the movement and stuff like that in the beginning, whose vision, if you can remember, was all of that? Or maybe it was like a group effort. But
I'm sure it was a group effort in the end in terms of like the minor adjustments and all that, but a lot of that kind of creativity and changing things like that was Vega. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Vega always had this way of, and like writing body to drum parts, you could always tell like that was the Vega part. Like it had a different pop to it, but that was a lot of that drumming and doing different crossover things and using different drums.
Yeah. Okay. You go through that 2013 season.
Well, I was going to say that aging out, right? After doing this for so long, you can see it coming, right? It's like it's coming at you, and then all of a sudden, like you wake up on, the day after finals, and you're like, don't have to do that again. Not gonna play that stuff again.
So how many total years did you do?
I did 5 RCC and then 4 Blue Devils and Impulse Mystical before that.
So 7 years of
7 drum
summers.
corps.
Wow.
And you accomplished so much. Like you won individual. We didn't even talk about that. You won individuals, and won some rings. You guys won high percussion once or twice during that time.
09 and 12.
09 and 12. So bookending, beginning and end. When you think about drum corps as a performer, did you get to do everything you wanted to do?
Yeah, definitely.
Nothing left on the bucket list and stuff.
I mean, it was everything I hoped for at the time, from everything that I was told that it might be, and so, and I think if you ask people like, you like indoor more, like outdoor more, at that time, aging out of drum corps felt like a lot more, and maybe because it was Blue Devils and you're just there all summer and the investment feels like way more than, you got to go home and you have a different life during indoor. I don't know what it is, but, the cool thing about indoor is the performance side of it and that type of connection. But yeah, at that time, aging out of drum corps was really special.
Have you ever sat and thought about like winning high percussion 2012 on a completely different instrument as being the section leader, like how like different that is for you? Have you ever thought about it in like those terms? Like, I'm like, I don't know. What's the question?
It's an accomplishment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's and in an activity where it's like nonstop, right? And it's like only one group gets to win every year and do these things, but it happens every year, and then you go to indoor and all that stuff. So unique experiences, right? Like what Rob is describing are rare, by definition. Did you recognize that as being like a unique experience for you? Like when that happened?
Yeah. Have you ever thought about that? Like maybe later, like, well, I can't believe I did that on snare.
Yeah. And I'm more humbled by it than like, dang, I did that,
Yeah.
I think it still feels like it was a massive privilege to be able to do that. Because the learning never stopped. It was never like, all right, like I'm on snare, or like, all right, I'm section leader. It was like, no, it's like there's so much to do. Like that was the most stressful season because it felt like, it was like, oh, I'm finally able to sleep. All right, go to bed tonight. Like it felt like there was just all day I was just on mentally. And I think a big part of that is because I put that on myself to bring in the snares pretty often to keep us kind of emotionally and mentally in check.
I was gonna bring up something then because you just reminded me. I asked Olander to hit me up with some things that I could bring up. He said that there was a story about 2012 where you guys lost the Colts facility because the team was there or something. You guys couldn't rehearse, so you had a snare sectional or something like that.
Yeah. So that was a humbling experience too, and I think this is. So me, it was a snare sectional, and then we were at the hotel. We had a snare sectional because there were still things that just weren't hitting. That was a pretty tough season in terms of our consistency and clarity. And after the sectional was done, Jared stayed with the center 3, which was me, Keelan, and Corey, and we just worked through a bunch of stuff and simply agreeing. And yeah, that was like late in the season. And that was still a learning process, and it was still an eye-opener of like, all right, like being in the middle isn't about just going. Like you hear stories about that, like, oh, that section leader, like tempo is so good, or like, oh, that section leader, like they're just going or whatever. Like it's like, no, everyone listen to me. Like that's not going to produce a cohesive sound. I think for the snare line, I think that middle person's job is to make the people outside of them sound good. And so you're making those very micro adjustments. Otherwise, you're just going and not, paying attention to what they're doing. Then you're relying on all of them. Like, all right, you got to be perfect. Good luck. And so
there's a weird thing. Like what you're saying, I can, like, sort of the version that I experienced as I got later in my career was, whenever anybody played with me, I could decide whether it was easy to play with me or hard. Mm-hmm. Whether it was going to be easy to play clean with me or difficult.
Right.
And it's these tiny micro adjustments, and sometimes it's just intention. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's literally just, what do you want to have happen? Right. And that gets produced in the hands. And it's not like you're dirting out on purpose or picking a particular rhythm to whatever. No, it's do you want it to be together or not? Yeah. And so that idea of you can make the people outside, you can literally change the way they sound. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that was something Scott was big on for me. Like, hey, John, just have great rhythms right now. And so I know that's like obvious to everybody listening. They're like, yeah, you gotta have good rhythms. And so that became like my biggest priority. And I do think I got way better just by simply making that like a number one focus. But what I was failing at was having that balance of making the people outside of me sound good and giving them that opportunity to work together rather than just like go with me. And so, yeah, that was a big impact for something that was so micro.
Do you have anything?
No, I was going to say, we're talking about the transition from as a performer into an instructor. Mm-hmm. How did that happen? Did you instruct RCC first or Blue Devils?
And it kind of sounds like Jared, like you said, Jared was like, you're going to be teaching, one day. Like, so did people around you know?
Or was Arcadia High School like your first teaching gig?
No, that was not my first teaching gig. I didn't start teaching Arcadia until 2017. I mean, I helped out like in 2012, 2013, but that was just like a few times just to go in and work with the quads. And while I was marching, I taught schools that were in the Coachella Valley. Mm-hmm. But in terms of teaching Blue Devils and RCC, it wasn't something that was just like a natural, like, all right, like, yeah, they're just going to teach. I mean, it was talked about, but it actually happening, it didn't feel that way. So in terms of aging out, 13, I didn't teach indoor in 14, but started teaching RCC indoor in 15. And that was kind of through starting to teach the fall with Jared and then him kind of bringing me in as a quad tech in 15. And 2012, Age Out Drum Corps. 2013, I started teaching Crown. I taught the quad line at Crown for that summer and kind of got connected to that team through Dean, because Dean was a quad tech and he wasn't going to be teaching anymore. And so he connected me with them and taught them. And just asked Scott if I could come back home, and he was open to it. And 2014, started teaching with Jared, working with the snares. And I taught the quads at RCC 15, 16, 17, and then shifted focusing more on the snares with Regua in 18 to now.
Was that an organic shift?
No, a lot of things shifted that year. Okay. From 17 to 18.
Yeah.
In terms of staff and the direction with things, and so that was more of it was very deliberate, but it was also a natural thing. Like, this is what I've been doing at Blue Devils and already teaching those guys, and working with Regua was a good move. Learned a lot from him and still learning a lot from him. So
you taught snares and quads. You played both of those. Mm-hmm. Are you afraid of the basses?
A little bit. No, I'm not afraid of basses.
You never had that itch to try to play bass?
Not play it in terms of like I'm gonna audition and go play bass somewhere, but I was very into learning about the mechanics. And technique,
or even teaching, because like you even said, you're kind of like an analytical guy. Mm. So I would assume that you'd want to know everything on how all that works as well. Is that something you've researched and maybe at one time wanted to teach?
No, not like explicitly, but I definitely would talk to different bass drummers and get an idea of what they thought about and bridge my own ideas into that. What I thought was most natural and efficient. And I also taught with Jeremy in the desert, and some days I'd be like, hey, I'm gonna go work with the bass drums. I want to test this thing out. And
yeah.
So I'd work with them a little bit.
Because that's something George and I, because he always has that itch to want to teach like basses, and he has he has theories and like stuff that's out there, like not the norm techniques, and it's cool to hear,
Yeah, so. When the first time I had a bass drummer ask me for a private lesson, I was like, okay, and it's exciting. It's exciting to get in there and be like, okay, like you said, like let's find the thread. Mm-hmm. Let's find the thing that where what I know very deeply and explicitly here, how can that translate over here? Mm-hmm. And what can I learn? What are the things that I can do over here, that I can bring back? Blanket question: as you made the transition, what kind of teacher are you? I mean, because here's what's interesting is, if you stop and think about it, there really are sort of, I would say, teachers have really strong tendencies. Teachers have a lot of things that they naturally, maybe without even being aware of it, they lean on heavily because of who they are and what's important to them, or what they're good at, and maybe they sort of shy away from what they're not so good at. What do you emphasize a lot? What do you, where do you live and breathe as a teacher?
Is it quality of sound? Is it notes?
This is good. We got a couple more hours, man. No, I'm saying that. I'm joking because I don't know if you remember during early COVID, we had a couple conversations, and
those were great.
Yeah, I loved it, and we just talked about mechanics, and I think. There's gonna be people out there like, yeah, but, and so there are like camps of, what you should primarily focus on. Like there's people out there who are just like the sound guys, like just listen. There's people out there who are like, but the hands. There's people out there who are like tempo, like beat, and it's like, why can't we bridge all this stuff? And so that has been my goal, like. And it's developed, right? I think when I first started teaching that, like say 14 snare line, a lot of how I thought and a lot of my own approach was not implemented. It's not exactly what we were doing yet. And yeah, I learned a lot from Jared, and we did things together. And this is, advice to young instructors, like don't just be a copy of your instructor. Like take what you liked and be open to what you think didn't work, and maybe it's a flaw in how you think about it or how you're actually utilizing it, or maybe it's an actual flaw, and then you make that approach something that's going to benefit how you like to teach. And so I think that's how I've operated was, all right, I liked this, I like that, I like that. How are my strengths going to facilitate using all this info and produce something? Like, what is that? And so a lot of my first year, teaching at Blue Devils in the snare line was just getting my philosophy in their heads. Yeah. It's like, hey, this is how we want to think about this. Like, this is what this means. Like, this is how we want to approach this. And it was just laying down a foundation of developing a filter. Like, so when you get information, this is what you want to filter it through. This is what it means. This is what the questions are that you need to ask yourself. And I would say that led to, because it was very general, it led to like, oh, this person's saying do this, this person's saying do that. It's like, well, both are true, but you can't do one or the other because the other's going to sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And I think a very, very common thing is, and I say this a lot, those of you who out there who've, heard me say this, but if something is slow, and someone's like, hey, drive it, tempo, go. And then it's in time, right? And then you have this bad, harsh sound quality. Yeah. And then it's like, someone else is like, hey, like warm up that sound, soft hands, blah, 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 whatever other words people like to use. And it's like, great sound. And then slow again. And so there's an effort that underlies that balance. And so what I like to do is I center a lot of what I talk about around efficiency through mechanics while having the ears open, right, to help bridge that gap, and how you manipulate that intensity and effort based off of a few factors, right? So yeah, and the way that we do that is simply through discussion, right? I think that is the best way to see how they think and make adjustments. Like they say, we're talking about a weighted downstroke or something like that. They might interpret that one way, ask them what they're thinking, ask them how it felt, and then reframe it. And so then we're all speaking the same language, and then they have the same intent that you're looking for. And so, yeah, a lot of how we do things is just through talking to them a lot and seeing how they think and, getting their feedback and then trying something again and constantly trying to bridge that gap between like you're just listening versus the mechanics. Because I do think, and it's not just in drums, but it's also in sport. Like thinking about the top athletes in the world who are in the Olympics, they're not training just to get stronger by brute force. Like they're training their technique. They're training like the smallest mechanics to get that extra bit of efficiency. And so efficiencies,
because they're trying to shave that 1/10 of a second off, or get that little bit faster. And so they're looking at angles. They're looking at which muscle group are you using. They're getting, because at that level, that's what you need.